The morning of September 14th, 1850, brought an unusual silence to the Cartwright plantation in Wilkins County, Georgia. The cotton fields stretched endlessly under the pale autumn sky, but something felt different that day. Margaret Cartwright, a widow of 38 years, stood on her front porch watching the field hands begin their daily labor. What none of them knew was that this would be the last normal day any of them would experience. The Cartwright estate had been in the family for 3 generations. Built in 1822 by Margaret's late father-in-law, the plantation house sat like a white monument against the red Georgia clay. The property encompassed nearly 2,000 acres, with the main house positioned on a slight elevation that allowed a view of the entire operation. Behind the house, a row of slave quarters stretched in a neat line, housing 43 people who worked the land from sunrise to sunset. Margaret had inherited the plantation 18 months earlier when her husband Thomas died unexpectedly from a fever. At the time of his death, the property was valued at approximately $40,000, making it one of the more substantial holdings in the county. The slaves alone were worth nearly $25,000, according to the tax records filed that spring. Among the field hands was a young man named Samuel, 22 years old, who had been born on the plantation. What made Samuel different from the others wasn't his work ethic or his quiet demeanor. It was his eyes. Anyone who looked closely could see they were the exact same shade of green as Thomas Cartwright's had been. The same eyes that Margaret saw every morning when she looked at her own son, William. The resemblance between Samuel and William had been whispered about in the slave quarters for years, but never spoken aloud in the presence of white folks. Both young men were tall and lean, with the same strong jawline and the same way of holding their heads when they concentrated. William was 19, born in 1831. Samuel was 22, born in 1828. The mathematics of their births told a story that everyone understood, but no one dared speak. Thomas Cartwright had purchased Samuel's mother, Rose, in 1827 from a plantation in South Carolina. She was 16 years old and described in the bill of sale as healthy breeding stock. The timing of Samuel's birth 9 months later had not gone unnoticed by the other slaves, though Rose herself never spoke of it. She died when Samuel was 12, taking whatever secrets she held to her grave in the small cemetery behind the quarters. Margaret had always maintained the fiction that the resemblance was coincidental. When neighbors or visitors commented on how Samuel looked like he could be William's brother, she would laugh it off with a wave of her hand. "Slaves sometimes pick up the mannerisms of their masters," she would say. "It's nothing more than imitation." But the truth was more complicated than Margaret wanted to admit, even to herself. She had known about Thomas and Rose. She had known about other women, too. The knowledge sat in her chest like a stone, growing heavier with each passing year. When Thomas died, she thought the burden would lift. Instead, it seemed to press down harder than ever. The morning that changed everything began when Samuel was sent to the main house to repair a loose shutter on the second floor. It was unusual for field hands to work on the house itself. That was typically left to the domestic slaves. But Margaret's house servant, Mamie, was ill with a stomach ailment. Samuel had shown aptitude for carpentry work in the past, so the overseer, a thin man named Jeremiah Moss, directed him to handle the repair. Samuel worked quietly outside William's bedroom window, his hammer tapping steadily against the wood. Inside, William was packing his belongings for his departure to the University of Georgia in Athens. He had been accepted to study law, following in his father's footsteps. The acceptance letter had arrived in July, and Margaret had been preparing for his departure with a mixture of pride and anxiety. As Samuel worked, he could hear William moving around inside the room. At one point, William came to the window to get some fresh air, The two young men found themselves face to face, separated only by the glass and the wooden frame. They looked at each other for a long moment, neither speaking. William was the first to turn away. That afternoon, Margaret called Samuel into the house. This was highly unusual. Slaves were typically summoned to the back door and spoke with the mistress on the porch or in the kitchen, but Margaret had Samuel brought to the front parlour, where she sat in her late husband's chair. According to later testimony from Mamie, who overheard parts of the conversation while pretending to dust in the hallway, Margaret asked Samuel directly about his parentage. She wanted to know what he remembered about his mother, what Rose might have told him about his father. Samuel answered that his mother had said very little, only that his father was a good man who couldn't acknowledge him. Margaret then asked Samuel if he had noticed the resemblance between himself and William. Samuel said he had, but that he'd never spoken of it to anyone. Margaret nodded and dismissed him, but not before saying something that Mamie couldn't quite hear. All she caught were the words never and brother. That evening, Margaret wrote a letter to her attorney in Augusta, a man named Colonel James Whitfield, who had handled her husband's estate. The letter, which was later found among Whitfield's papers after his death in 1864, was brief but troubling. It read, "James, I find myself in need of your counsel regarding a delicate family matter. There is a situation that threatens the stability of my household and William's future prospects. I will be traveling to Augusta next week to discuss this in person. Please arrange for private accommodations. This matter must be handled with utmost discretion." The following week, Margaret made the journey to Augusta, leaving the plantation in the capable hands of Jeremiah Moss. She was gone for 3 days. When she returned, she called the overseer to a private meeting in the study. What they discussed was never recorded, but afterwards Moss was seen walking to the slave quarters with a grim expression. The next morning, Samuel was nowhere to be found. Moss announced to the other slaves that Samuel had been sold to a plantation in Alabama. This was not unusual in itself. Slaves were bought and sold regularly, often with little notice. But several things about Samuel's disappearance struck the other slaves as strange. First, no trader had been seen on the property. Second, none of Samuel's few possessions were missing from his quarters. Third, Moss couldn't provide the name of the plantation where Samuel had allegedly been sold. When the field hands asked about Samuel's departure, Moss became agitated. He told them that Samuel had been an ungrateful troublemaker, and that they would be wise not to ask too many questions about him. The subject was closed, he said, and anyone who continued to discuss it would face consequences. But slaves have their own ways of communicating, and word of Samuel's strange disappearance spread quickly through the network of plantations in the county. The story that emerged was consistent. Margaret Cartwright had somehow made Samuel vanish without a trace. Some believed he had been sold to traders heading west. Others whispered darker possibilities. William returned home from his first semester at university in December of 1850. He immediately asked about Samuel, having noticed his absence among the field hands. Margaret told her son the same story she had told everyone else, that Samuel had been sold to a plantation in Alabama. William accepted this explanation without question, though he later mentioned to a cousin that he had been surprised by the sale, since Samuel had always been a reliable worker. The winter of 1850-51 passed quietly on the Cartwright plantation. Margaret threw herself into the management of the property with an intensity that surprised even Moss. She spent long hours reviewing the account books, planning the next year's cotton crop, and corresponding with buyers in Savannah. To outside observers, she appeared to be a capable widow, managing her late husband's estate with admirable efficiency. But the domestic slaves noticed changes in their mistress. Mamie later told her daughter that Margaret had begun talking to herself while alone in the study. She would sit in Thomas's chair for hours, having conversations with someone who wasn't there. Sometimes Mamie could hear her saying, "He's just a slave, not your brother," over and over again, as if she were trying to convince herself of something. Margaret also began having trouble sleeping. She would pace the halls of the house at night, stopping to look out windows toward the slave quarters. On several occasions, Mamie found her standing in Samuel's old room in the quarters, staring at the empty space where his pallet had been. When asked what she was doing, Margaret would claim she was checking for signs of mice or rot. In February of 1851, a traveling preacher named Reverend Josiah Banks came to Wilkins County to hold revival meetings. Banks was known throughout Georgia for his powerful sermons about sin and redemption. He stayed at various plantations during his circuit, and Margaret invited him to spend 3 days at the Cartwright estate. Banks was a thin man, with intense grey eyes and a voice that could carry across a cotton field. He preached about the weight of unconfessed sin and the necessity of true repentance. His sermons were particularly focused on the idea that buried guilt would always find a way to surface, no matter how deeply it was hidden. On his second night at the plantation, Banks dined with Margaret and William, who was home for a brief visit between university sessions. The conversation turned to the moral obligations of slaveholders and the proper Christian treatment of their human property. Banks spoke passionately about the need for masters to treat slaves with basic humanity while maintaining proper authority. During this conversation, Margaret made a comment that both Banks and William found odd. She said that sometimes the greatest kindness was to remove temptation entirely, even if others might misunderstand the action. When pressed to explain what she meant, she claimed she was speaking generally about the challenges of plantation management. Banks later wrote in his journal about his stay at the Cartwright plantation. The entry, discovered years later when his papers were donated to the Georgia Historical Society, included this observation: "Mrs. Cartwright appears to be a woman wrestling with some great burden of conscience. She speaks much of duty and propriety, but I sense a deep unease in her spirit. She asked me repeatedly about the permanence of certain sins, and whether some acts could ever be truly forgiven. I told her that all sins could be forgiven through genuine repentance, but she seemed unsatisfied with this answer." On his final morning at the plantation, Banks asked Margaret if she would like to make a formal confession of her sins. This was a common practice during revival meetings, and many plantation owners participated as an example to their slaves. Margaret declined, saying she would prefer to commune with God privately. Banks respected her decision, but noted in his journal that he had rarely seen a soul in such evident torment. After Banks departed, Margaret's behavior became more erratic. She began insisting that certain areas of the plantation be avoided by the slaves. The old tobacco barn, which hadn't been used in 5 years, was declared off-limits. She also forbade anyone from working in the far corner of the cotton field near Blackwater Creek, claiming the soil there was too poor for cultivation. Moss found these restrictions puzzling, but followed his employer's wishes. He was well compensated for his discretion, and had no desire to question Margaret's decisions too closely. As long as the plantation remained profitable and the slaves stayed in line, he was content to manage the daily operations without delving into his employer's motivations. The spring planting season of 1851 proceeded normally despite Margaret's restrictions. The cotton was planted in neat rows across the accessible fields, and the slaves settled into their familiar rhythms of work. But there was an undercurrent of tension that hadn't been there before. The slaves whispered among themselves about the forbidden areas and about Samuel's continued absence. A new development emerged in April, when a slave named Jupiter, who worked in the stables, claimed he had seen Samuel near the tobacco barn on a moonless night. Jupiter was known for his tall tales, and most of the other slaves dismissed his claim as fiction. But a few days later, another slave, a woman named Celia, who worked in the house, said she had heard hammering coming from the direction of the barn late at night. Moss investigated these reports, but found nothing unusual about the tobacco barn. The door was still securely locked, and there were no signs of recent activity around the building. He reported this to Margaret, who seemed relieved by his findings. She told him that the slaves were probably letting their imaginations run wild, and that he should ignore their gossip. But the reports didn't stop. Over the following weeks, several slaves claimed to have heard strange sounds coming from various parts of the plantation at night. There were reports of digging near Blackwater Creek, of voices carrying on the wind, and of lights moving through the tobacco barn. Moss began to suspect that some of the slaves were deliberately spreading false stories to create unrest. In May, Margaret received an unexpected visitor. Colonel Whitfield, her attorney from Augusta, arrived without advance notice. He told Moss that he needed to speak with Margaret about urgent legal matters. The two spent several hours in the study with the door closed. When Whitfield emerged, his face was pale, and his usual jovial demeanor was replaced by a grim seriousness. Whitfield left the plantation that same day without staying for dinner, which was unusual for a man known for his appreciation of good food and company. Before departing, he was overheard telling Margaret that some actions cannot be undone, and that she needed to think carefully about the consequences of her choices. That night, Margaret called Mamie to the study. According to Mamie's later testimony, Margaret asked her directly if any of the slaves had been asking questions about Samuel. Mamie admitted that there had been some discussion, but claimed it was nothing more than idle curiosity. Margaret then asked if Mamie believed the recent reports of strange sounds and sights around the plantation. Mamie said she told Margaret that slaves often saw and heard things that weren't there, especially when they were frightened or uncertain. This seemed to satisfy Margaret, who dismissed Mamie with instructions to report any unusual behavior among the slaves directly to her. The summer of 1851 was brutally hot, even by Georgia standards. The cotton grew thick and green under the blazing sun, but the heat seemed to intensify the strange atmosphere that had settled over the plantation. Margaret spent most of her time indoors, claiming that the sun aggravated headaches she had been suffering since spring. William returned home for the summer break and immediately noticed the changes in his mother. She had lost weight and developed dark circles under her eyes. She startled easily and often seemed lost in thought during their conversations. When he asked about her health, she blamed the stress of managing the plantation alone and assured him that she was simply tired. William also noticed the restrictions Margaret had placed on certain areas of the property. When he asked about them, she explained that she was concerned about the slaves' safety. The tobacco barn was old and potentially dangerous, she said, and the area near Blackwater Creek was prone to flooding. William accepted these explanations, but privately thought they seemed excessive. One evening in July, William was walking near the forbidden corner of the cotton field when he heard what sounded like someone calling his name. The voice was faint and seemed to come from the direction of the creek. He followed the sound, but found nothing except the usual sounds of night insects and flowing water. When he mentioned the incident to Margaret the next morning, she became visibly agitated and forbade him from walking in that area again. The incident troubled William more than he cared to admit. The voice had sounded familiar, though he couldn't place where he might have heard it before. He found himself thinking about Samuel and wondering what had really happened to him. The official story about the sale to Alabama had always seemed abrupt and poorly explained. In August, a disturbing discovery was made by accident. A heavy rainstorm caused the creek to overflow its banks, washing away soil near the restricted area. When the water receded, Celia was collecting firewood when she noticed something protruding from the muddy ground. Upon closer inspection, she realized it was a piece of cloth, specifically a torn section of the type of rough cotton shirt worn by the field hands. Celia immediately reported her discovery to Moss, who went to investigate. What he found was enough to send him directly to Margaret with an ashen face. Buried in the soft soil near the creek bank was what appeared to be human remains, partially wrapped in the remnants of slave clothing. Margaret's reaction to this news was swift and decisive. She instructed Moss to rebury the remains immediately and to tell no one about the discovery. She also ordered him to bring Celia to the house for a private conversation. What was said during that meeting was never recorded, but Celia emerged from the house an hour later, looking deeply shaken. She never spoke about finding the cloth again. Moss followed Margaret's instructions and covered the remains with fresh soil and stones from the creek bed. He then posted signs warning that the area was unstable due to erosion and forbade anyone from going near it. To anyone who asked, he explained that the recent flooding had made the ground dangerous and unpredictable, but word of Celia's discovery had already begun to spread among the slaves before Margaret's intervention. By the time she attempted to suppress the information, several people had heard about the cloth and the remains. The whispers that had started with Samuel's disappearance now became more urgent and specific. The slaves began to speak openly about their belief that Samuel was dead and buried somewhere on the plantation. Margaret seemed to sense that her control over the situation was slipping. She began spending more time watching the slaves from her bedroom window, noting their movements and conversations. She also started keeping a pistol in the study, claiming it was for protection against potential runaways or outside troublemakers. The tension on the plantation reached a breaking point in early September when Jupiter, the stable hand who had claimed to see Samuel near the tobacco barn, was found dead in his quarters. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but Jupiter was only 28 years old and had shown no signs of illness. Dr. Edwin Marsh, who examined the body, noted in his report that Jupiter appeared to have died peacefully in his sleep, but several of the other slaves whispered that they had heard sounds of a struggle coming from his quarters the night before. Jupiter's death sent a wave of fear through the slave community. He had been the most vocal about his belief that Samuel was still on the plantation, and his sudden demise seemed like too much of a coincidence. The slaves began to avoid the areas where Jupiter had claimed to see Samuel, and several requested to be transferred to different quarters farther from the forbidden zones. Margaret attended Jupiter's funeral, which was held in the small cemetery behind the slave quarters. She stood apart from the mourners, watching as Jupiter was lowered into the red Georgia clay. According to witnesses, she remained at the graveside long after everyone else had departed, staring down into the open earth as if transfixed by what she saw there. That night, Margaret was seen walking through the slave quarters, carrying a lantern. This was highly unusual behavior for a plantation mistress who typically avoided the quarters after dark. Mamie later testified that she followed Margaret at a distance and watched as her mistress stopped at several doors, listening intently to the sounds from within. At Jupiter's empty quarters, Margaret stood for nearly an hour, occasionally speaking in low tones to someone who wasn't there. The following week brought another unsettling development. William announced that he had decided to change his course of study at university from law to medicine. This decision surprised everyone, including Margaret, who'd been looking forward to her son following his father's path as a lawyer. When asked about his change of heart, William said only that he had become interested in understanding the mysteries of life and death. William's new interest in medicine included a fascination with post-mortem examinations and the signs that could indicate various causes of death. He began checking out books from the university library about anatomy and pathology, subjects that would have been considered morbid for a young gentleman of his social standing. His professors noted his particular interest in cases involving poisoning and suffocation. When William returned home for a brief visit in October, he asked Margaret detailed questions about Jupiter's death. He wanted to know if Dr. Marsh had performed a thorough examination and whether anyone had noticed any symptoms of illness in the days before Jupiter died. Margaret deflected these questions, suggesting that William's medical studies were making him unnecessarily morbid. But William's curiosity had been awakened, and he began to investigate on his own. He spoke privately with several of the slaves about Jupiter's final days, and what he learned disturbed him. Multiple witnesses reported that Jupiter had been in good health and spirits right up until the night of his death. More troubling, several slaves mentioned that Jupiter had been planning to speak with Margaret about something he had discovered near the tobacco barn. William also learned about Celia's discovery near the creek and about the rumors surrounding Samuel's disappearance. The picture that emerged was far different from the simple story of a slave being sold to another plantation. William began to suspect that something terrible had happened to Samuel and that his mother might be involved in covering it up. On his last night at home before returning to university, William confronted Margaret directly. He told her about the things he had learned from the slaves and asked her to tell him the truth about what had happened to Samuel. Margaret's reaction was swift and severe. She accused William of listening to slave gossip and threatened to cut off his university funding if he continued to pursue such unwholesome interests. The confrontation between mother and son lasted for several hours and grew increasingly heated. According to Mamie, who overheard parts of the argument from the kitchen, William accused Margaret of lying about Samuel's fate and demanded to know why she had forbidden access to certain areas of the plantation. Margaret, in turn, reminded William of his duties as the heir to the estate and warned him that his suspicions could destroy their family's reputation and fortune. The argument ended with William storming out of the house and riding back to Athens that same night, rather than waiting for morning as planned. He left behind a note for Margaret that simply read, "I cannot remain silent about what I suspect. Samuel deserves justice, no matter the cost to our family name." Margaret burned the note immediately after reading it, but the damage was done. William's departure marked the beginning of the final phase of a tragedy that had been building for more than a year. Margaret knew that her son would not abandon his investigation, and she began to make preparations for what she saw as the inevitable exposure of her secrets. In November of 1851, Margaret wrote her final letter to Colonel Whitfield. This letter, unlike her previous correspondence, was not found among his papers after his death. However, Whitfield's response, dated November 23, 1851, survived and provides insight into Margaret's state of mind. Whitfield wrote, "My dear Margaret, I cannot in good conscience advise you to pursue the course of action you have described. The consequences of such a step would be irreversible and would likely result in outcomes far worse than the current situation. I urge you to reconsider and to seek spiritual counsel before making any final decisions." On December 1, 1851, Margaret Cartwright dismissed Jeremiah Moss from his position as overseer. She told him that she was simplifying the plantation's operations and would be managing the property herself with the help of the house slaves. Moss was surprised by this decision, as the plantation had been running efficiently under his management. But he accepted the generous severance payment Margaret offered and departed for a position on a neighboring estate. With Moss gone, Margaret was left alone with the slaves and her growing paranoia. She began to suspect that they were plotting against her, planning to expose her secrets to the authorities in town. She started carrying her pistol at all times and installed new locks on all the doors and windows of the main house. The slaves, meanwhile, were becoming increasingly fearful of their mistress. Her erratic behavior and Jupiter's unexplained death had created an atmosphere of dread throughout the quarters. Several of the field hands approached Mamie about the possibility of running away, but she discouraged them, knowing that the consequences of being caught would be severe. On December 15th, 1851, William returned home unexpectedly from university. He had not completed his fall semester, claiming that family obligations required his immediate presence. In reality, he had spent weeks researching similar cases in medical and legal journals, trying to understand the truth about Samuel's disappearance and Jupiter's death. William's return caught Margaret off guard. She had been hoping to have more time to prepare for his inevitable confrontation with the evidence he was gathering. When he arrived at the plantation, he brought with him a carpet-bag containing books about forensic investigation and several pages of handwritten notes documenting his research. The reunion between mother and son was tense and formal. William made it clear that he had not abandoned his investigation, and that he intended to search the plantation for evidence of what had happened to Samuel. Margaret, for her part, maintained her innocence, but seemed resigned to whatever her son might discover. That evening, William began his investigation in earnest. He started with the tobacco barn, using a crowbar to break the lock that Margaret had installed. Inside, he found the building largely empty, except for some old farming equipment and several piles of dirt that seemed out of place. Using a shovel from the barn, he began to dig in the areas where the soil seemed disturbed. What William found in the tobacco barn was a collection of personal items that he recognized as belonging to Samuel. A carved wooden whistle that Samuel had made for himself, a small Bible with his name written inside the cover, and a leather pouch containing a few coins. These items had been hastily buried under a thin layer of dirt, as if someone had intended to retrieve them later but never returned. Armed with this evidence, William confronted Margaret again. This time, faced with physical proof of her deception, Margaret's resistance began to crumble. She admitted that Samuel had not been sold to another plantation, but maintained that his death had been accidental. According to her version of events, Samuel had threatened to expose the truth about his parentage and had become violent when she refused to acknowledge him as Thomas's son. Margaret claimed that Samuel had attacked her in the study on the night of his disappearance, and that she had shot him in self-defense. Panicked by what she had done, she had enlisted Moss's help in disposing of the body and creating the fiction about the sale to Alabama. The burial near Blackwater Creek had been intended to be temporary, but the approaching winter and the need to maintain the deception had made it permanent. William listened to his mother's confession with growing horror. The idea that his half-brother had been murdered and buried on their own property was difficult enough to accept, but the realization that his mother had lived with this secret for more than a year was almost unbearable. He demanded to know about Jupiter's death and whether Margaret had been responsible for that as well. Margaret initially denied any involvement in Jupiter's death, but when pressed, she admitted that she had given him a mixture of herbs that she claimed would help him sleep better. Jupiter had been asking too many questions about Samuel and had threatened to report his suspicions to the sheriff in town. The herbs, she said, were only meant to make him drowsy so he would stop his investigation. She claimed she had not intended for the dose to be fatal. With his mother's confessions weighing on him, William faced an impossible choice. He could report the crimes to the authorities, knowing that it would mean his mother's execution and the destruction of his family's reputation and fortune, or he could remain silent and become complicit in covering up two murders. William spent several sleepless nights wrestling with his decision. He walked the plantation grounds, visiting Samuel's grave near the creek, and standing in the tobacco barn where his half-brother's possessions had been hidden. He also spoke with several of the slaves, trying to gauge their knowledge of the situation and their likely reactions if the truth were revealed. What William discovered was that the slaves already knew most of the truth. They had pieced together the evidence of Samuel's murder and Jupiter's suspicious death, and they were living in constant fear that they might be next if they spoke out. The only thing preventing them from running away or reporting their suspicions was their understanding that no white authorities would believe their word against that of their mistress. Faced with this reality, William made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. On December 23rd, 1851, he confronted Margaret one final time. He told her that he would not report her crimes to the authorities, but that he could no longer live with the knowledge of what she had done. He was leaving the plantation permanently and would never return. Margaret pleaded with her son to reconsider, offering to make whatever amends were possible and promising to confess her sins to their minister. But William's decision was final. He packed his belongings and departed that same day, leaving behind a letter that formally transferred ownership of the plantation to his mother and renounced any claim to his inheritance. In the letter, which was later found among the plantation's business papers, William wrote, "I cannot inherit property that has been built on murder and deception. I cannot call myself a Christian while benefiting from the suffering my family has caused. I leave this place to the judgment of God and history, knowing that justice will come in its own time, even if I am not brave enough to demand it now." Margaret was left alone on the plantation, with 42 slaves who knew her secrets and had every reason to hate her. The isolation and guilt began to take an even greater toll on her mental health. She stopped attending church services in town and rarely left the plantation grounds. The few visitors who came to the estate reported that she appeared haggard and spoke incoherently about voices she heard at night. In January of 1852, Margaret made an unexpected decision. She announced to the remaining slaves that she was freeing them all, and that they were welcome to leave the plantation whenever they chose. This announcement was met with suspicion rather than celebration. The slaves understood that Margaret's sudden generosity was motivated by guilt rather than genuine compassion, and they feared that accepting freedom from her might somehow make them complicit in her crimes. Several of the younger slaves did choose to leave, making their way north along the underground railroad routes that had been established through Georgia. But many of the older slaves, particularly those with families, remained on the plantation. They had nowhere else to go, and no means of supporting themselves as free people. They continued to work the fields and maintain the property, though now as paid laborers rather than enslaved people. Margaret's attempt at redemption through manumission did little to ease her psychological torment. She continued to hear voices calling her name at night, and claimed to see Samuel's figure walking through the cotton fields. Mamie, who remained as Margaret's housekeeper, later testified that her former mistress would often be found in the morning, sitting in the study with her pistol in her lap, claiming that Samuel had visited her during the night and demanded justice. The spring planting of 1852 was a disaster. Margaret lacked the knowledge and organizational skills to manage the plantation effectively, and many of the former slaves were reluctant to follow her instructions. The cotton crop that year was the smallest in the plantation's history, and Margaret was forced to sell several parcels of land to cover her expenses. As word of Margaret's troubles spread through the county, neighbors began to ask questions about the plantation's decline and about William's sudden departure. The official story was that William had decided to pursue his medical studies in Europe and that Margaret was having difficulty managing the property alone. But rumours persisted about strange happenings on the Cartwright estate and about the real reasons for the family's apparent disintegration. In June of 1852, Dr. Edwin Marsh visited the plantation to check on Margaret's health. She had been complaining of headaches and insomnia, but what Marsh found was evidence of a complete mental breakdown. Margaret was barely eating, rarely slept, and spent most of her time talking to people who weren't there. Her physical appearance had deteriorated dramatically, and she appeared to have aged 10 years in the 18 months since her husband's death. Dr. Marsh recommended that Margaret be placed under the care of relatives or be admitted to an asylum for treatment. However, Margaret had no close living relatives, and she refused to consider institutionalization. She insisted that she needed to remain on the plantation to protect the family's secrets and to wait for Samuel's forgiveness. On July 4th, 1852, Margaret Cartwright was found dead in her study by Mamie. She was sitting in her late husband's chair with her pistol in her hand and a single gunshot wound to her head. On the desk beside her was a letter addressed to the authorities of Wilkins County that contained a full confession of her crimes against Samuel and Jupiter. In the confession, Margaret wrote, "I have lived with the weight of my sins for too long. I killed Samuel because I could not bear the truth of what he represented, the evidence of my husband's betrayal and the threat to my son's inheritance. I killed Jupiter because he would not stop asking questions about Samuel's fate. I thought I could bury the truth with their bodies, but the dead do not stay silent. They have called to me every night since, demanding the justice I denied them in life. I go now to face whatever judgment awaits me, praying that God will have more mercy on my soul than I showed to those I wronged." The discovery of Margaret's body and her confession sent shockwaves through Wilkins County. The revelation that 2 slaves had been murdered on the Cartwright plantation and that the crimes had been covered up for nearly 2 years challenged many assumptions about plantation life and the relationships between masters and slaves. Sheriff Thomas Brennan, who investigated the case, ordered the exhumation of Samuel's remains from their burial site near Blackwater Creek. The body was identified through the testimony of several slaves who had known Samuel well. Jupiter's body was also exhumed and examined, revealing evidence consistent with poisoning rather than natural death. The legal aftermath of Margaret's confession was complicated by her death and by the social realities of antebellum Georgia. There was no precedent for prosecuting a dead woman for the murder of slaves, and many white citizens preferred to treat the entire incident as a private family tragedy rather than a criminal matter. The case was officially closed without any additional investigations or prosecutions. William Cartwright, who was located in Philadelphia, where he had been working as a medical assistant, returned to Georgia briefly to settle his mother's estate. He arranged for proper burials for Samuel and Jupiter in the plantation cemetery and used the proceeds from the sale of the property to provide modest financial settlements to their surviving relatives. The former slaves scattered after Margaret's death and the plantation's sale. Some traveled north to join free black communities, while others remained in Georgia and found work on neighboring plantations. Mamie, who had witnessed so much of the tragedy, moved to Augusta, where she worked as a seamstress until her death in 1878. The Cartwright plantation house stood empty for several years after the sale. Local residents reported strange sounds coming from the property at night, and several attempts to reoccupy the house ended quickly when new owners complained of disturbing dreams and unexplained phenomena. In 1857, the house was demolished and the land was converted to a timber operation. William Cartwright never returned to Georgia after 1852. He completed his medical training and established a practice in Pennsylvania, where he specialized in treating former slaves who had escaped to freedom. He never married and never spoke publicly about his family's history, though he was known to make anonymous donations to organizations working to abolish slavery. In 1864, William wrote a letter to a friend that provided insight into his feelings about the tragedy that had destroyed his family. He wrote, "I have spent 12 years trying to understand how a person could commit such terrible acts and then live with the knowledge of what they had done. I have concluded that my mother was driven mad not by guilt alone, but by the impossible contradictions of the system she was trying to preserve. She could not acknowledge Samuel as her husband's son without destroying the fiction that made slavery acceptable to her conscience. She could not allow the truth to surface without admitting that the wealth and status she was trying to protect had been built on lies. In the end, she chose murder rather than honesty, and it destroyed everything she was trying to save. The story of the Cartwright plantation became a cautionary tale told in whispers throughout Wilkins County for decades after Margaret's death. It served as a reminder of the hidden costs of slavery and the way that the system's inherent contradictions could poison even those who benefited from it most. The graves of Samuel and Jupiter remained in the plantation cemetery long after the house was demolished and the land changed hands. Local residents, both black and white, would sometimes place wildflowers on the graves, though few knew the full story of how the two men had died. The headstones, paid for by William Cartwright, bore simple inscriptions. Samuel, born 1828, died 1850. He deserved better. And Jupiter, born 1823, died 1851. His questions were too dangerous for some to hear. In 1896, a local historian named Professor Jonathan Hayes attempted to research the Cartwright case for a book about plantation life in antebellum Georgia. Hayes interviewed several elderly former slaves who had lived on the property, including a woman named Sarah, who had been Celia's daughter. From these interviews, Hayes was able to piece together additional details about the psychological atmosphere on the plantation during Margaret's final months. According to Sarah's testimony, Margaret had begun to believe that Samuel and Jupiter were communicating with the other slaves from beyond death, organizing them for some kind of supernatural revenge. Margaret had started measuring salt around the doors and windows of the main house and had forbidden the slaves from singing the spirituals they traditionally performed while working. She believed that the songs were actually coded messages between the living and the dead. Professor Hayes's research was never published as a book, though his notes survived in the archives of the University of Georgia. In his conclusions, Hayes wrote, "The Cartwright case represents more than a simple story of murder and madness. It illustrates the psychological impossibility of maintaining a system based on the dehumanization of other human beings." Margaret Cartwright was destroyed not by external enemies, but by the internal contradictions of trying to be a Christian, a loving mother, and a slave owner all at the same time. The system she was trying to preserve demanded that she deny the humanity of people she knew to be human, and that denial ultimately made her incapable of recognizing her own humanity as well. The final documented reference to the Cartwright case appeared in 1932, when the Wilkins County Historical Society placed a marker near the site where the plantation house had stood. The marker read simply, "Cartwright Plantation, 1822 to 1857, a reminder that the past is never truly buried." The marker was removed in 1968, following complaints from local residents who felt it drew unwanted attention to a story they preferred to forget. Today, the land where the Cartwright plantation once stood is part of a state forest. Hikers occasionally report finding old foundation stones and rusted farming equipment hidden among the pine trees. The cemetery where Samuel and Jupiter were buried has been largely reclaimed by vegetation, though careful observers can still make out the outlines of several graves beneath the kudzu and brambles. The Blackwater Creek still flows through what was once the corner of the cotton field where Samuel's body was first buried. Local fishermen sometimes report catching glimpses of movement in the water that might be fish, or might be shadows, or might be something else entirely. The creek runs clear and cold, carrying its secrets toward the larger rivers that will eventually take them to the sea. There are no ghosts in this story, only the lingering weight of actions that cannot be undone and words that cannot be taken back. Margaret Cartwright's declaration that Samuel was just a slave, not your brother, echoes across the decades not as a supernatural phenomenon, but as a reminder of the human capacity for self-deception and cruelty. It serves as evidence that some lies are too terrible to live with, and that the truth has a way of demanding recognition, no matter how deeply it is buried or how long it takes to surface. The tragedy of the Cartwright plantation was not unique in the antebellum South, though it may have been unique in the completeness of its documentation. Margaret's confession and William's correspondence provide an unusually detailed window into the psychological costs of slavery for those who participated in it, willingly or unwillingly. Their story suggests that the system's victims included not only those who were enslaved, but also those who were trapped within the moral contradictions of slaveholding society. In the end, Margaret Cartwright's attempt to preserve her family's status and wealth through violence and deception accomplished exactly the opposite of what she intended. Instead of protecting the Cartwright name, her actions destroyed it entirely. Instead of securing William's inheritance, her crimes drove him into permanent exile. Instead of silencing the truth about Samuel's parentage, her confession ensured that the story would be preserved for future generations. The widow's lie that he's just a slave, not your brother, was meant to maintain the boundaries that slavery required, the artificial distinction between those who were considered human and those who were treated as property. But the lie could not change the biological reality that Samuel and William shared the same father, or the moral reality that both deserved to live and to be acknowledged for who they were. Margaret's inability to accept these truths led her to commit acts that haunted her until the day she died, and her story continues to haunt the landscape where it unfolded more than a century and a half later. The Cartwright case stands as a testament to the idea that historical injustices cannot simply be buried and forgotten. Even when the perpetrators are dead and the immediate victims are silent, the consequences of their actions continue to reverberate through time. The story reminds us that the past shapes the present in ways both visible and invisible, and that understanding history requires us to confront uncomfortable truths about the people and systems that came before us. Until today, some doors should perhaps remain closed, and some questions should perhaps go unasked. But the story of Samuel, Jupiter, and Margaret Cartwright suggests that the most dangerous secrets are often those that everyone already knows, but no one is willing to speak aloud. In 1850, as today, the greatest courage may be required not to uncover the truth, but to act upon it once it has been revealed.